I speak 9 languages, the young black waitress said softly, and for a split second the entire VIP section of the Manhattan rooftop restaurant seemed to forget how to breathe before erupting into light laughter that cut through the elegant dinner like glass tapping on crystal, and at the center of it all William Harrington, a billionaire known for building hotels across 3 continents, leaned back in his leather chair with a smirk that carried both amusement and disbelief as if he had just heard the most entertaining joke of the evening, while Ava Collins stood beside the table holding a tray steady with practiced calm, her posture straight, her expression unshaken even as eyes from every direction settled on her like weight, and the city lights of New York flickered behind her through the glass walls as if the skyline itself was watching what would happen next. Claire Donovan, the restaurant manager, took a careful step forward with an uneasy smile trying to smooth the moment. But Ava did not move or correct herself or laugh along, she simply met the gaze of the people around her with quiet certainty that did not match the uniform she wore, and William tilted his head slightly as he studied her like someone trying to decide whether to be entertained or annoyed. 9 languages, he repeated with a low chuckle. You mean like menu phrases or actual languages? The table chuckled again. A couple of guests exchanging glances as if this were part of the evening's entertainment, but Ava's voice remained steady when she answered, actual languages, sir, and that single word sir carried a calm weight that briefly disrupted the rhythm of the laughter. Ethan Blake, one of William's business partners visiting from Chicago, raised an eyebrow and leaned forward slightly, speaking in rapid Italian as if testing a theory rather than a person, and without hesitation Ava responded in the same language fluently. Her accent precise, her delivery natural, so natural that the smile on Ethan's face faded mid-expression. The table shifted almost imperceptibly, like a room adjusting its temperature. William noticed it immediately but refused to acknowledge it at first. Instead he tapped his fingers lightly on the table and switched to German, expecting hesitation, expecting performance, expecting failure, but Ava responded again, this time without even pausing to think, her words flowing smoothly as if she had lived in them, and a subtle silence began to form around the edges of the table, not yet disbelief but no longer amusement either. Claire glanced nervously at the seating chart as if it might explain what was happening, while William let out a breath through his nose and leaned forward, now studying her more closely, his tone shifting just slightly, still casual but sharpened by curiosity. Where did you learn all that? He asked, and Ava adjusted her grip on the tray before answering simply, I studied, I practiced, I lived in them. And for the first time William did not laugh immediately. Instead he looked at her in a way he hadn't before, as if recalculating something he thought he already understood. But the room was still waiting for him to dismiss it, still expecting the billionaire to turn this moment back into a joke, and Ava remained still, not challenging, not pleading, just present, as if she already knew that what came next would reveal more about them than about her. And outside the glass walls the city continued to glow indifferent and vast, while inside a single sentence had already begun to fracture the shape of the evening, quietly, invisibly. Like the first crack in something everyone thought was unbreakable, the laughter did not disappear immediately. It lingered like a fragile echo that the room was pretending not to notice, and William Harrington slowly leaned back in his chair again as if reclaiming control of the atmosphere simply by refusing to react too quickly, his fingers now resting still on the edge of the table while his eyes stayed locked on Ava Collins, studying her with a new kind of attention that was no longer amused but not yet convinced. And around them the rooftop restaurant continued its quiet luxury rhythm, the soft clink of glassware, the distant hum of New York traffic 30 stories below, the faint scent of expensive wine and cedarwood drifting through the air, yet somehow everything felt slightly shifted, like a painting that had been tilted just enough for the frame to feel unfamiliar. Claire Donovan stepped closer again, her voice low and careful as she addressed Ava, suggesting gently that she return to her duties. But Ava only nodded once and adjusted her tray as if nothing unusual had happened at all, and that calmness unsettled more than any argument could have, because it was not defensive or emotional, it was absolute. Ethan Blake leaned back now, crossing his arms as he watched William out of the corner of his eye, clearly recognizing that the moment had moved beyond casual entertainment, and he spoke again, this time in Spanish, slower, more deliberate, as if offering Ava one last opportunity to reveal a trick, but Ava responded instantly, her Spanish flawless, measured, and naturally paced, and this time no one laughed, not even William, who simply exhaled once through his nose and glanced briefly at Ethan as if silently confirming what neither of them wanted to acknowledge yet. Claire looked visibly unsettled now, glancing between Ava and the guests as if trying to find a way to restore normalcy, but normalcy was already slipping. William finally spoke again, his tone quieter now, less performative, asking where she had learned so many languages with that level of precision. And Ava paused just long enough to place her tray carefully on a nearby service table before answering that she had spent years working across different cities, listening first. Studying always, never assuming she would be given opportunities but taking every small one she could find, and as she spoke, the confidence in her voice was not prideful but grounded, as if she was stating something as simple as the weather. Ethan tilted his head slightly, now fully focused, and asked her in Japanese a question about business terminology, and Ava responded without hesitation again. Her pronunciation so clean it made the surrounding guests exchange uneasy glances. William's expression tightened slightly, not in anger but in recalibration, like someone watching a system behave in a way it was not supposed to. He leaned forward now, elbows near the table edge, and said calmly that 9 languages was not something he had ever seen from anyone outside of specialized diplomatic circles, let alone a restaurant employee, and for the first time Ava's gaze shifted slightly downward, not from shame but from restraint, as if she was deciding how much of herself was necessary to reveal in a room that had already decided not to believe her. Claire stepped in quickly, attempting to redirect the conversation by mentioning busy service and reservations, but William raised one hand. Slightly, not aggressively but enough to pause her mid-sentence, and the table obeyed that gesture instinctively, because authority like his did not need volume, only intention. The silence that followed was heavier now, not awkward but expectant, and Ava lifted her eyes again, meeting William's gaze directly, not challenging him but refusing to shrink, and in that moment the dynamic at the table shifted in a way no one announced, because the question was no longer whether she was telling the truth, but whether anyone there was prepared to understand what it meant if she was. The silence at the table stretched longer than anyone expected, not because nothing was happening, but because everything had already begun to change in ways no one could immediately name, and Ava Collins stood exactly where she had been, hands resting calmly at her sides, her expression unchanged as if the pressure of every gaze in the room had no authority over her internal world, while William Harrington remained leaning slightly forward, his attention now fully locked, no longer performing for his guests but observing like a man recalculating a system he once believed was simple. Ethan Blake shifted subtly in his seat, glancing between William and Ava with a growing sense that the moment had moved far beyond casual curiosity, and Claire Donovan stood frozen for a second longer than she intended before forcing herself to step forward again, attempting to restore the structure of service by quietly reminding Ava that she was still on duty, but Ava gave a small polite nod without breaking eye contact with the table, and that simple composure created an even deeper tension because it suggested she was choosing when and how to participate rather than reacting. William finally broke the silence again, this time asking in a more measured tone whether she had ever worked in formal interpretation or translation roles beyond hospitality, and Ava responded evenly that she had worked in international environments where communication required precision under pressure, where misunderstandings could change outcomes, and where listening mattered as much as speaking, and as she spoke there was no attempt to elevate herself, only to clarify, yet every word seemed to reposition her in the eyes of those listening. Ethan leaned slightly forward again and asked her in French about a technical business phrase used in cross-border negotiations, and Ava answered without delay, her French fluid and naturally structured, and this time even Claire stopped moving entirely, her hands hovering near her clipboard as if she had forgotten what she was supposed to do. William exhaled slowly and leaned back just a fraction, the faintest narrowing of his eyes suggesting that disbelief was no longer an option he could maintain comfortably. He tapped one finger once against the table as if marking a mental calculation and then asked Ava where she had acquired such linguistic depth, not in a dismissive tone now but in a genuinely investigative one, and Ava paused briefly, her gaze shifting toward the distant city lights beyond the glass, as if the answer required her to acknowledge a version of her life that did not fit neatly into the setting she currently stood in, and she explained calmly that she had spent years moving between environments where she was often the person expected to understand others first, where she worked multiple roles, observed conversations in different languages, and learned through necessity rather than convenience, and as she finished speaking, the atmosphere at the table subtly tightened again, not with hostility but with reassessment, because the assumption that had shaped the first moments of laughter was no longer stable. Ethan exchanged a quiet look with William, and for the first time neither of them smiled. Claire finally spoke again, her voice slightly less certain, mentioning that Ava had always been one of the most reliable staff members in the restaurant, but even as she said it, the word sounded insufficient compared to what had just been demonstrated. William turned his attention fully back to Ava, now speaking more slowly, asking if she could comfortably switch between languages in real time without preparation, and Ava confirmed simply that she could, because she had done so in environments where there was no time to hesitate, and that answer did not create excitement or applause, only silence, a different kind of silence than before, one that felt heavier because it was no longer filled with laughter or doubt but with the uncomfortable beginning of understanding that something previously underestimated might have been standing in front of them the entire time. And in that quiet shift, William Harrington stopped seeing a waitress performing an unusual skill and began seeing something else entirely, something that did not yet have a name in the context of this dinner, but had already begun to change the way the entire table felt about what they thought they knew. The atmosphere on the rooftop had shifted into something far less playful than it had been at the start of the evening, and now every sound felt carefully measured, as if even the clink of glassware might disturb a fragile balance that no one wanted to break, while William Harrington remained seated with a stillness that was more commanding than any movement he had made earlier, his eyes fixed on Ava Collins with a level of focus that had replaced all traces of amusement, and Ethan Blake sat slightly forward now, no longer participating as a guest but observing like someone witnessing a negotiation unfold without clear rules. Claire Donovan looked increasingly uneasy, her professional instincts pulling her between managing service and managing a situation that no longer resembled anything routine, and Ava herself stood unchanged in posture, composed and steady, as if the shifting perception around her did not alter her internal certainty. William finally spoke again, this time with a quieter tone that carried more weight than before, asking Ava directly if she had ever been formally tested or certified in her language abilities, and the question was no longer dismissive but investigative, as if he was trying to locate the edge of something he could measure. Ava answered calmly that she had completed formal assessments in multiple contexts during previous work experiences, but she did not volunteer more than necessary, and that restraint only made the room more attentive. Ethan leaned slightly toward William and said in a low voice that if what she claimed was accurate, her level of fluency would exceed most professional interpreters he had worked with in international contracts, and William did not respond immediately, instead studying Ava as though recalibrating a long-held assumption. Then he gently pushed the conversation further, asking in Russian a question that required precise understanding of business nuance. And again Ava responded without hesitation, her pronunciation controlled, her phrasing accurate, and the meaning delivered with clarity that left no room for doubt. At that moment Claire's expression shifted from concern to disbelief, and one of the nearby guests who had been quietly observing leaned slightly toward another and whispered something that was immediately silenced by the weight of the moment. William exhaled slowly, then leaned back again, but this time there was no trace of humor in his expression, only calculation. And he finally acknowledged aloud that what he was witnessing did not align with his expectations of someone in Ava's position, yet even as he said it, he did not frame it as praise or surprise, but as a statement of contradiction he needed to resolve. Ava remained calm, her hand steady, her voice even when she spoke, explaining once more that language was not something she had learned in isolation but something she had lived through necessity, adapting constantly to environments where communication determined opportunity. And as she spoke, the tone of the table shifted again, not toward laughter or disbelief but toward a kind of uncomfortable respect that no one had explicitly agreed to. Ethan asked her in Mandarin, a complex phrase used in financial structuring discussions, and Ava responded immediately with correct usage, and this time even William did not interrupt. Claire slowly lowered her clipboard, as if realizing that administrative structure had no relevance to what was unfolding. William finally stood from his chair, not abruptly but deliberately, and the subtle movement caused the entire table to fall into complete silence. He walked a small step closer to Ava, not invading her space but reducing the distance between authority and assumption. And he asked her in a lower voice why someone with such abilities was working in a role that did not reflect them, and for the first time Ava paused longer before answering, her eyes briefly shifting toward the city skyline beyond the glass, as if the question touched something more layered than language itself. And when she spoke, her response was not defensive but measured, stating that opportunities are not always distributed according to ability, and that sometimes people build lives within the space they are given rather than the space they deserve. And those words settled into the table with a weight that no one immediately challenged. Ethan looked down briefly at his glass, William remained still, and Claire stood frozen in place, realizing that what she had thought was a disruption in service had become something far more complex. And the room that had once laughed now held a silence shaped not by disbelief but by the gradual recognition that value can exist in places people are too quick to overlook, while Ava Collins stood unchanged, as if she had always expected this moment not as validation, but simply as the truth finally being noticed. The silence that followed Ava Collins's words did not feel like an ending, but rather like a pause before something irreversible, as if the rooftop itself had become aware that nothing about the evening could return to what it had been before, and William Harrington stood still near the edge of the table with a presence that no longer carried the ease of a host but the focus of someone confronting an unexpected truth, while Ethan Blake remained seated but visibly quieter, his earlier curiosity now replaced by a reflective tension in his posture, and Claire Donovan no longer attempted to manage the situation, instead watching Ava as if trying to reconcile the person she had known in a professional context with the reality unfolding in front of her. Ava herself remained composed, her hands relaxed at her sides, her expression calm and steady, not seeking approval or validation, only waiting as if she understood that the moment had reached a natural turning point. William finally broke the silence, his voice lower now, not performative but direct, asking Ava whether she had ever considered pursuing her abilities in a formal international capacity rather than remaining in service work, and the question carried a different tone than before, no longer dismissive or testing, but carefully measured, as if he was trying to understand the shape of a possibility he had previously overlooked. Ava took a slow breath before answering, stating that she had once worked in environments where interpretation and communication were central responsibilities, but circumstances had shifted her path, and she had learned to adapt rather than resist change. And as she spoke, William's gaze softened slightly, not in sympathy but in recognition of complexity. Ethan leaned forward again, asking quietly if she had ever worked with corporate delegations or diplomatic teams, and Ava confirmed that she had supported multilingual communication in structured professional settings, though she did not emphasize titles or prestige, and that restraint made her answers feel even more grounded. William turned slightly toward Ethan, exchanging a brief glance that carried unspoken alignment, as if both men were beginning to understand the implications of what they were hearing. Claire finally spoke again, her voice more cautious than before, mentioning that Ava had always performed her duties flawlessly within the restaurant, but even as she spoke, her words sounded reduced compared to the depth of what had just been revealed. William raised a hand slightly, signaling a pause, and the room obeyed without question, the guests who had been quietly observing now fully absorbed in the shift that had taken place. He then asked Ava a final question, his tone carefully neutral, asking whether she had ever been formally offered positions that matched her linguistic capabilities, and Ava hesitated briefly before answering that opportunities had been presented in the past, but personal circumstances and responsibilities had led her to prioritize stability over advancement. And as those words settled into the space, the atmosphere at the table shifted once more, not toward disbelief or amusement, but toward a quiet recalibration of judgment. Ethan looked down at the table, processing the contrast between expectation and reality. Claire stood motionless, realizing that her earlier assumptions no longer held any foundation, and William Harrington finally stepped back from the table slightly, his expression no longer focused on questioning Ava but instead reflecting inward consideration, as if the presence in front of him had forced a revision not only of perception but of principle. And in that moment the rooftop dinner, once defined by luxury and routine, had transformed into something far more fragile and significant, because what stood before them was no longer a curiosity to be explained, but a truth that had already begun to reshape the way each of them understood value, ability, and the quiet spaces where both are often overlooked. The rooftop atmosphere had shifted into something that no longer resembled a casual dinner, but rather a quiet convergence of attention around a truth that refused to be simplified. And Ava Collins remained standing beside the service station with steady composure, her presence no longer interpreted through the lens of assumption but through the growing weight of reconsideration, while William Harrington stood slightly apart from the table now, his posture no longer relaxed as a host but measured as an observer trying to understand the implications of what he had just heard. Ethan Blake sat still with his hands resting near his glass, no longer engaging in curiosity-driven testing but instead reflecting with a restrained silence, and Claire Donovan had fully abandoned any attempt to manage the situation as service, instead watching Ava with a quiet uncertainty that reflected the collapse of her earlier framework. William finally spoke again, but this time his voice carried a different tone entirely, no longer probing or analytical in a detached sense, but carefully deliberate, as if each word was being weighed against something larger than the conversation itself. He asked Ava if she had ever intentionally stepped away from professional opportunities that would have placed her in international linguistic or advisory roles, and the question lingered in the air with a seriousness that caused even Ethan to look up again. Ava took a moment before responding, her gaze steady but not rigid, explaining that she had accepted roles when stability allowed, but there had been periods in her life where personal responsibility required her to choose paths that did not align with her full potential, and as she spoke, there was no tone of regret, only clarity, as if she had long since made peace with the structure of her choices. William listened without interruption, his expression shifting subtly as he processed not only her words but the discipline behind them. Ethan leaned slightly forward again and asked her quietly if she had ever worked in environments where simultaneous interpretation under pressure was required, and Ava confirmed that she had, describing situations where accuracy and timing were critical and where communication between multiple parties depended entirely on her ability to remain composed. And as she finished, the table remained silent for a brief moment that felt longer than it was. Claire finally spoke in a lower voice, acknowledging that she had always known Ava to be reliable and precise in her work, but now realizing that those qualities were only the surface of something significantly more developed. William moved a step closer again, not invading space but reducing distance, and asked Ava if she had ever considered re-entering that level of professional work, and Ava replied that she had not actively pursued it because life had required focus on immediate responsibilities rather than long-term positioning. And as she said this, the simplicity of her tone contrasted sharply with the magnitude of what it implied. Ethan glanced toward William again, and this time there was no skepticism left in his expression, only recognition that they were no longer evaluating potential but acknowledging reality that had been present without their awareness. William exhaled slowly and placed one hand on the edge of the table, his attention fixed on Ava with a seriousness that had replaced all earlier detachment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a measured gravity, noting that environments like his required individuals who could operate across cultures, languages, and negotiations without hesitation. And for the first time the implication of his words was not dismissive but exploratory, as if he was considering what it would mean to redefine assumptions within his own structure. Ava listened without reaction, her posture unchanged, her calmness not performative but consistent, and that consistency itself became the most compelling element in the room, because it did not demand recognition, yet inevitably commanded it. Claire lowered her gaze briefly, as if realizing that the framework she had relied on for evaluation no longer applied, and Ethan leaned back slightly, his earlier confidence in judgment replaced by a quieter awareness of misalignment between appearance and reality. William Harrington finally fell silent again, not because he had nothing to say, but because for the first time in the evening he was no longer certain that words were sufficient to define what he was beginning to understand. And in that silence the rooftop dinner transformed completely, no longer an event defined by status or conversation, but a moment where perception itself had been forced to adjust to something that had always existed but had only just been seen. The silence that had settled over the rooftop dinner no longer felt like hesitation or disbelief, but like a collective awareness that something irreversible had already taken place in the way each person in the room perceived the woman standing beside the service station. And Ava Collins remained composed, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, as if she had long since learned that recognition was not something she needed in order to remain certain of herself, while William Harrington stood near the edge of the table with a stillness that now carried more weight than authority, because it was no longer the stillness of control but of reflection. Ethan Blake remained quiet, his earlier attempts at interpretation now replaced by a restrained focus that suggested he was reconsidering every assumption he had made since the beginning of the evening. And Claire Donovan stood slightly behind the service counter, her hands lowered, no longer attempting to intervene or manage the flow of the moment, because the moment itself had moved beyond her role entirely. William finally spoke again, but his voice was no longer structured by curiosity or testing. Instead it carried a measured calm that suggested internal recalibration. And he asked Ava whether she had ever been in a position where her linguistic skills had been formally evaluated in professional environments that required certification or institutional validation, and the question hung in the air not as challenge but as inquiry. Ava paused briefly before answering, her tone consistent and unshaken, explaining that she had undergone assessments in multiple international settings during previous professional engagements, but that much of her experience had been gained through real-time application rather than formal academic recognition. And as she spoke there was no attempt to elevate herself, only to clarify what had already been lived. Ethan shifted slightly and asked in a quiet tone whether she had ever participated in multilingual negotiations or structured international meetings, and Ava confirmed that she had supported communication in environments where accuracy directly influenced outcomes, and her words carried a simplicity that contrasted with the complexity they implied. William listened without interruption, his gaze steady, and for the first time he did not immediately follow with another test or question. Instead he allowed the information to settle, as if he was measuring not her ability but the implications of its existence in a context he had previously overlooked. Claire finally spoke in a subdued voice, acknowledging that Ava had always demonstrated exceptional reliability in her professional duties at the restaurant, but even as she said it, her words felt insufficient, like they belonged to a smaller version of reality that no longer matched what was standing in front of her. William took a slow breath and asked Ava if she had ever been offered a formal role that matched her level of capability. And Ava answered honestly that such opportunities had existed at different points, but life circumstances and personal responsibility had required her to prioritize stability and continuity over advancement, and as she said this there was no tone of regret, only clarity, as if the decision had been understood and accepted long ago. Ethan lowered his gaze briefly, absorbing the contrast between potential and path, while William remained still, his expression now fully serious, no longer shaped by surprise but by reflection. And when he finally spoke again, his voice carried a quieter gravity, noting that in environments like his, communication across languages was not simply a skill but a structural necessity, and individuals capable of operating at that level were rare, not because they did not exist, but because they were often unseen in places where no one thought to look. Ava did not respond immediately, her attention steady, her calm presence unchanged, and that steadiness became the defining element in the room, because it did not demand acknowledgment yet made avoidance impossible. Claire lowered her eyes again, realizing that her previous understanding of Ava had been limited by context rather than truth, and Ethan leaned back slightly, no longer analyzing but accepting that his earlier confidence in judgment had been incomplete. William Harrington finally stepped back from the table just enough to break the stillness, and when he spoke again, it was not to test or to challenge, but to acknowledge that what he had witnessed had shifted something fundamental in his perception, not of Ava alone, but of how easily capability can exist unnoticed within structures that rarely pause to recognize it. And in that moment the rooftop dinner was no longer an encounter defined by status or expectation, but by the quiet realization that understanding often arrives only after assumptions have already been dismantled. The rooftop no longer carried the energy of a social gathering, but instead felt like a suspended moment of recognition, where every person present understood that the conversation had moved beyond entertainment or curiosity and into something far more lasting. And Ava Collins stood quietly beside the service counter with the same calm presence she had maintained from the beginning, her hands relaxed, her posture unchanged, as if the shifting perceptions around her had never once altered her internal certainty, while William Harrington remained slightly apart from the table, no longer leaning forward or testing with questions, but standing in a reflective stillness that suggested his thoughts were no longer focused on proving anything but on reconsidering everything. Ethan Blake sat with a lowered gaze, his expression no longer marked by analytical interest but by a quiet acceptance that the assumptions he had entered the evening with were incomplete, and Claire Donovan remained motionless near the service station, her earlier attempts at control now fully dissolved into observation, as if she had become aware that the structure she relied on no longer applied to what she was witnessing. William finally broke the silence, but when he spoke, his tone was no longer investigative or evaluative. Instead it carried a calm restraint that reflected internal alignment rather than external questioning, and he acknowledged that what had begun as a simple observation of an unexpected claim had now become something that challenged the way value and capability were typically perceived in environments like his. Ava did not respond immediately, her expression steady, allowing the silence to remain undisturbed, and in that silence Ethan slowly raised his head, as if realizing that there was nothing left to test or verify, because what had already been demonstrated required no further validation. Claire finally exhaled softly, her attention shifting downward as though recalibrating her understanding of the person she had worked alongside, and William turned his gaze briefly toward the city beyond the glass, the lights of Manhattan stretching outward like a reminder of scale and complexity, before returning his focus to Ava, not with authority but with consideration. And when he spoke again, his words carried a quieter depth, noting that environments built on global communication depended on people who could operate without hesitation across linguistic and cultural boundaries, and that such individuals were often overlooked not because they lacked visibility and ability, but because their roles rarely aligned with traditional expectations of recognition, Ava remained composed as she listened, her presence unchanged, and when she finally responded, her voice was calm and precise, acknowledging that her experience had taught her to adapt rather than to seek acknowledgment, and that effectiveness had always mattered more than visibility in the work she had done. And as those words settled into the space, the table remained still, not in confusion but in reflection, because the narrative they had unconsciously built at the beginning of the evening no longer matched the reality they were now required to consider. Ethan leaned slightly back in his chair, his expression thoughtful rather than analytical, while Claire slowly brought her hands together in front of her, as if grounding herself in the present moment, and William Harrington finally stepped back from the table once more, his posture no longer engaged in assessment, but in contemplation, and when he spoke again it was not to question Ava but to acknowledge the shift that had taken place in his own perception, recognizing that capability often exists independently of the environments that are prepared to notice it, and that assumption can obscure reality even in spaces where precision is expected. Ava gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not as acceptance of praise but as recognition of understanding, and in that quiet exchange the rooftop dinner transformed fully into something no longer defined by hierarchy or expectation, but by the understated realization that what is overlooked is not always absent, and what is dismissed is not always lacking, and the evening closed in a silence that carried not disbelief, but a recalibration of judgment that each person at the table would carry beyond that moment. The silence that had settled across the rooftop now felt different from anything that had come before it, no longer uncertain or tense but instead settled into a quiet clarity that followed the collapse of assumption, and Ava Collins remained in the same place beside the service counter, her presence unchanged, steady and composed as if the weight of every revised judgment around her had never once altered her sense of self, while William Harrington stood slightly away from the table, no longer in the posture of a man evaluating a situation, but in the stillness of someone who had already absorbed its meaning and was now adjusting the framework of what that meaning required. Ethan Blake sat quietly with his hands resting near his glass, his earlier analytical posture replaced by a reflective calm that suggested he no longer needed confirmation, and Claire Donovan remained near the service area, her attention lowered briefly as if she was processing a realization that no longer required immediate response. William finally spoke again, but when he did, his voice carried a restrained finality rather than inquiry, acknowledging that what had taken place during the evening had not been a demonstration of exception, but a revelation of perspective, and that environments like his often failed not because they lacked capability, but because they misidentified where capability was likely to appear. Ava listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, as if she understood that recognition was not something she needed to pursue, only something that occasionally arrived. Ethan shifted slightly in his seat, looking once more toward Ava, but this time without curiosity or testing, only with acknowledgement, and Claire slowly exhaled, her shoulders easing as though a silent internal recalibration had finally completed itself. William took a small step back from the table, allowing the distance between him and the moment to expand just enough for reflection, and when he spoke again, his tone was measured and calm, noting that leadership in global environments required constant reassessment of assumptions, and that what he had witnessed challenged the subtle biases that often went unexamined even in the most structured systems. Ava gave a small nod, not in agreement with praise but in recognition of understanding, and then for a moment no one spoke, because the need for explanation had dissolved. Ethan finally leaned back fully in his chair, his gaze shifting toward the city skyline beyond the glass walls, as if the scale of Manhattan itself now felt different than it had at the beginning of the evening. Claire returned her focus to the service station with a quiet steadiness, no longer attempting to manage perception but simply observing reality as it was, and William Harrington looked once more at Ava, not as an anomaly but as a reminder that judgment formed too quickly often misses the most important truths. And when he finally turned away from the table, it was not in dismissal or conclusion, but in contemplation, as if the evening had become something that would extend beyond its physical setting and continue within the decisions and perceptions that followed. And Ava remained where she stood, unchanged, grounded in the same calm presence she had carried from the beginning, while around her the rooftop slowly returned to its ambient rhythm, though for those who had been present, nothing about it could ever feel entirely the same again, because what had shifted was not the environment, but the understanding of what had been in it all along.